Explaining the Second Sino-Japanese War. From 1931 to 1937, the Japanese had invaded Manchuria, created a demilitarized zone, created a buffer state on the border with Mongolia, and had fought the Chinese in Shanghai. In 1937, Fumimaro Kono would become the Prime Minister of Japan. However, by then the military had already taken up many important positions within the government. Meanwhile, in China, the leader of the Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek, would begin building relations with No-No Germany in an attempt to build China's army. With a war against Japan looming, Chiang Kai-shek would unite many warlords and communists into a united front against the Japanese. However, some states such as the Guangxi clique and Xinjiang would remain independent. Finally, in July of 1937, Japanese troops which had been stationed outside of and had trained outside of Beijing for decades finally exchanged shots with Chinese troops. The Japanese would respond to this in the Marco Polo Bridge incident by launching a full-scale invasion without declaration of war, without the support of Prime Minister Kono. Within a month, the Japanese would capture Beijing, Tianjin, and would crush a mutiny in Hebei. They would then begin moving south. In response to this, Chiang would attempt to attack the Japanese in Shanghai. However, 200,000 Japanese reinforcements arrive, and by November, the Japanese had captured the city. The Japanese would then continue, and would quickly capture Nanjing, and for the next month would commit the raping of Nanjing, in which they would rape and kill hundreds of thousands. The Japanese would split their new land into different puppet regimes before continuing to try and capture the new Chinese capital of Wuhan. To try and stop the Japanese advance, the Chinese would flood the Yellow River. However, this would result in the death of many Chinese people and would destroy the region. This tactic would not stop the Japanese from taking Wuhan and would push many to join the communists over the Kuomintang. The warlord of Sichuan had died the previous year, and so the Kuomintang would move the Chinese capital to Chongqing, ending the autonomy of the region. The Japanese would bomb Chongqing. However, instead of deciding to capture the city, they would decide to go for port cities such as Canton throughout late 1938 and early 1939. Meanwhile, in the north, the Japanese puppet state on the Mongolian border, Mengjiang, would be expanded. From there, the Japanese would see a few defeats, as they would be defeated when trying to expand inland, and the communists would launch a few successful guerrilla campaigns. And the new Prime Minister of Japan, Hironuma Kichiro, would be forced to sign a non-aggression pact with the Soviets after the Japanese lost a battle with them. In the north, the generals of the McClique would prevent Japan's Mongolian allies from pushing west. They would also prevent Japanese agents from contacting Tibet to form an alliance. Kono would return to power in Japan after Japan made its first attempt at trying to take Changsha. In early 1940, the Chinese would unsuccessfully launch a counterattack. However, it would surprise the Japanese, and from there, a stalemate would ensue. However, the atrocities still continued, such as in Manchuria, Unit 731 would conduct horrible inhuman experiments towards prisoners. While the stalemate was going on, Japan would sign the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, forming the Axis powers, before, in September of 1940, invading French Indochina. In 1941, with Japan now under the control of Hideki Tojo, the Japanese would attack Hong Kong, Malaysia, and would ensue the bombings of Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into World War II. Due to the Tripartite Pact, the No-No Germans would stop sending supplies to the Chinese, and the Russians would also stop sending supplies to the Chinese due to a Chinese warlord breaking off relations with the Russians after they believed that the No-No Germans were going to win. This would force the Allies to fly supplies over Japanese-controlled Burma. Meanwhile, despite over 3 million soldiers dying in the Chinese army, with millions more civilians dying, the Chinese army continued to expand, and they would even send troops to help in French Indochina and Burma. However, in 1944, with the U.S. closing in on Japan, the Japanese would launch Operation Ichigo in an attempt to create a land bridge to Indochina from their territories in China. Operation Ichigo would prove to be a success, and the Japanese would finally connect their territories in mainland Asia. This would do nothing, however, as in August of 1945, the Japanese would have 2 atomic bombs dropped on them, while the Soviets invaded Manchuria from the north, which would have forced the Japanese to surrender. In the peace treaty, all of Japan's territories outside of the main archipelago would be stripped from them. China would be given Taiwan, and the communists in China would be given Manchuria by the Russians. This would give the communists a good holding during the Chinese Civil War. In conclusion, the Second Sino-Japanese War was a horrible war for the Chinese. Although they did win, the total casualties of the war can be anywhere from 15 million to 22 million. The Japanese committed multiple war crimes against the Chinese, which are just horrible to talk about. The outcome of this war would also shape the outcome of the ongoing Chinese Civil War between the Kuomintang and the Communists. Thank you for watching this video on the Second Sino-Japanese War.